You're listening to the Jake Asman Show on the SportsMap Radio Network.
Presented by Rocket Mortgage.
Live from the O'Reilly Auto Parts Studios, here's Jake Asman.
Our next guest is one of the best broadcasters in all of sports. Growing up, I actually had a poster of him because he was interviewing Derek Jeter after the Yankees won the 2009 World Series. So he's in that iconic photo of Jeter lifting the championship trophy. He is longtime broadcaster, now the host of the Chris Rose rotation through JomBoy Media. He is Chris Rose. Chris, thanks for getting up early on the West Coast and joining us.
You got it, Jake. How are you?
I'm hanging in. So, I wanted to start with something that I don't know if you get asked a lot about it at this point because the show's been off the air for over a decade. But growing up, one of my favorite things was watching the Best Damn Sports Show, period. To me, it was so ahead of its time. When you think back about that show, Chris, I mean, what stands out? Because that show really was just iconic if you were a sports fan growing up in the 2000s.
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting because I still get asked about it a ton, and it hasn't been on the air since 2009. And in fact, last night on my Twitter feed, somebody sent a clip of us interviewing Kobe Bryant, and it was, it was just remarkable to kind of take a stroll down memory lane with that sort of stuff. But it became the place where athletes and entertainers could just hang out. You know, it was really the first of its kind where it wasn't got ya journalism. Like they knew that they were comfortable, and the show wasn't for everybody, right? I mean, it wasn't, real sports with HBO. There's a time and a place for programs like that. They do an amazing job. But when we first started the show in 2001, I kind of felt like we were at a place in sports where we were taking it too seriously. And we forgot why we all love sports. And it's because of those athletes that play the games. And I thought it was really one of the first opportunities to get to know these guys outside of the arena in which they played. And we put them in fun situations where after a while, at the beginning, we were like, we'd love to have you come on the Best Damn Sports Show, period. And people were like, on what? And then after about a year, people were lining up to come on. And it just felt right when we were doing it at its apex.
If there was ever an opportunity to do some sort of reboot of that show, would you still be interested in being part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why wouldn't I be? It's ever since then, I've always tried to do shows that have humanized athletes. And obviously social media has broken down that wall immensely, right? Because we get a peek into their lives outside of what they do for a living. But with Intentional Talk on MLB Network, we always tried to interview guys and not so much talk about the hard-hitting baseball. And it's the same sort of thing I'm doing right now in the Chris Rose rotation, where I've got a half dozen active major leaguers as my rotating co-hosts. They're not guests, they're co-hosts. So for the entire hour, you'll get these guys. And we get into some really, really great stuff about their successes, their failures, their interests outside of baseball, why they think the game hasn't grown immensely. And they're very honest. And it's more than a 5-minute radio interview that you'll get with these guys twice a year. It's really, really fun. A couple of guys have actually teared up based on what we've talked about so far. So you're kind of going to run the emotional gamut with it.
Chris, I love the concept for the podcast, and I love that you're doing it through JomBoy Media because, I've always been a huge baseball fan, but I've always been, someone that's argued that baseball needs to do more to try and market its game and try and make these, players more interesting and get into more details about who they are as people, not just, as players and, people that put up statistics for a living. Like when you're interviewing these players, have you even been surprised at how open they've been with you on the podcast and how they have, I think agreed with a lot of fans that say that baseball needs more of that type of stuff to continue to grow the game?
Yeah, they know that the sport has done a crappy job in helping us understand who's inside the uniform. Naturally, you are going to root for your team or some other players that you like around the country. But sometimes we need a reason to care about them, too. You're going to learn, like the Archie Bradley episode. He just signed on with the Philadelphia Phillies, who spent the bulk of his career in Arizona, but was traded to the Reds for the last 30 games and now signed a 1-year deal with the Phillies. people may have seen a 10-minute interview here and there with Archie, and it's kind of known that he's loud, he's boisterous. And I've interviewed him 12 times before I sat down with him on the Chris Rose rotation. I had no idea he played Little League Baseball against Bryce Harper. And I was like, what? And he told us some amazing stories of facing Bryce back in the day during summer ball and stuff like that. He told us an unreal story about the night he got drafted, and a certain major leaguer reached out to him, to the entire draft class, about, just, hey, embrace the journey. It's going to be great. And Archie Bradley kind of went back at him on Twitter, and they had kind of a reunion of sorts in the major leagues. There's just so many stories that these guys can tell, and they don't really have a platform on which to tell it. And so hopefully I can be the conduit between guys who want to tell their story and the fans who want to find out a lot more about them, because there is an interest.
Chris Rose joining us here, of course, the host of the brand new podcast with JomBoy Media, the Chris Rose Rotation Podcast. Check it out now wherever you get your podcast. One issue that I also think baseball has, Chris, and maybe you could speak to this being, of course, a Cleveland baseball fan, is that there's just not enough teams year after year that are trying to win. In the NFL, every team feels like they have a chance year in, year out, that there's always hope. In baseball, I get the sense that there's at least half the league that really doesn't care whether or not they win or lose. They care about saving money and getting a high draft pick. How can baseball, essentially try and incentivize all its teams to try and compete each season?
Well, I'm going to disagree a little bit with you there. The A's and the Rays don't spend an immense amount of money, right?
Yep.
They're pretty good, right?
Absolutely. That's fair.
Okay, but your margin of error when you do not spend is extremely thin. So unless you have totally figured it out, you're going to be in the, all the way in the back. So I do agree with you that this past offseason was embarrassing for baseball. And, it drums up so much interest when your team is wheeling and dealing. I mean, look at what's going on with the most important position in sports in the NFL. You would never see the sort of quarterback movement we're going to have, right? Even just the fact that whether or not Russell Wilson stays in Seattle, there's that storyline every day. And Deshaun Watson in Houston, you get your hands on a guy like that, you would say, hey, we're set at quarterback for the next 15 years. Well, now here we are 4 years into his career, and the guy wants out because he doesn't trust the organization. So there's always something going on in the NFL. Same thing in the NBA. And baseball, the owners are like, yeah, we're good. Yeah, we're fine. We'll draft and develop, and we'll keep holding down their salaries. And it's wrong. It's a perfect way to piss off your fan base. So I would suggest not doing it. That's why I love what the Padres have done the last couple of years. And who cares what it means for them down the road? They're in a one-horse sports town now. You don't think they realize that? They're like, we're not going to suppress Fernando Tatis' service time. If he's the best shortstop on our team, he's going to start the 2019 season. And what they do? Less than 2 years later, give him a $340 million extension. And what does that mean for the fan base? It means they can buy a Tatis jersey, that they don't just have to wear their old Tony Gwynn and Trevor Hoffman jerseys. It means they can look forward to the present and the future.
Chris Rose with us here. There's a guy that pitches now for the LA Dodgers that, say whatever you want about him, he gets people to talk about him and gets people to talk about baseball. And that, of course, is Trevor Bauer. Do you like how Trevor Bauer kind of approaches, his brand and his social media? Do you like what he's done to basically raise awareness for the sport and obviously put a lot of attention on himself as well?
Yeah, I mean, I do like that aspect. I hate some of the stuff he's done on social media, and he's got to do a better job of owning it, not just saying, hey, I've learned from some mistakes. He should have taken a step in the forefront and said, listen, I was downright wrong, like 1,000% wrong. And sometimes I let my emotions on social media get the better of me. And if he had taken that step, then I would have given him an A+. Still, he does have the right interest in mind. I mean, listen, a lot of this has to do with Trevor Bauer. You know, he wants to be the most popular player in the sport. He has a vision. It hasn't taken away from him wanting to be the best player. You know, there were a handful of years ago, he said, I plan on winning 6 Cy Youngs. Like, I plan on being that great. And I can tell you this, as an Indians fan, I never felt cheated. I never felt like he wasn't prepared. I felt frustrated by him sometimes when, you know, he couldn't figure out the strike zone and he would have 100 pitches through 4 1/3. That would drive me nuts. But he figured it out in 2018. 2019 took a step back during the trade year. And then last year was sensational through 60 games. So I expect nothing less out of him as he continues to work in his lab and continues to promote himself on his social media platforms.
Chris, give me the baseball storyline that you are the most excited to watch unfold this year.
Not just because I'm in LA, but I'm a huge Ohtani fan. Have been since day one. I want to see if he can stay healthy. I want to see if he can continue to develop inside the batter's box and on the pitching mound. And if in turn that allows the best player in the sport to get back to October for just the second time ever. It frustrates me to no end that Mike Trout is unequivocally the best player in the sport and has played 3 playoff games. I mean, in what other sport does that happen? It never happens, obviously, in the NBA. NBA, you always make it with the best player. NFL, who's the best player? Patrick Mahomes. Some people say Aaron Rodgers. Some people might chime in Derrick Henry. Those guys all make the playoffs. They're not sitting on the sidelines in the most important and most watched part of the season. Mike Trout is as long as everything goes well with the pandemic, I don't want to see him sitting October 8th watching an Eagles game in the front row at the Link. I've had enough of that.
You're spot on there. Michael Kay has a great line, the longtime Yankees broadcaster. He would say this about A-Rod when he played on the Rangers. It's like having the Mona Lisa in the garage. I feel the same way about Trout. He's been too good to only have been in that a playoff series once in his great career.
Yeah, it drives me batty. I go off on it like 3 or 4 times a year, and I'm sure I will on this podcast too. I can't take it anymore. It's just, and it's not because the Angels haven't spent money. They have. They've just spent it poorly.
Chris Rose with us here. Finally, Chris, let's end on a happy note. You are, of course, a huge Cleveland Browns fan. It feels weird saying this, but it must be pretty good to be a Browns fan right now, right?
It was awesome this year. It was so good. So I have 2 sons, and they were born in L.A., but they are diehard Cleveland sports fans because of their sicko father. And when the Cavs won it all in 2016, and then a few months later, the Indians were in Game 7 of the World Series, I said, guys, as much joy as these teams have brought you, there is nothing, and I'm going to tell you, there is nothing like when the Browns are in contention. And they're like, Dad, you're full of crap. You don't know what you're talking about. They suck. They'll never be good. And finally this year, like when December hit and they were right in it, they were acting like I acted when I was 20 and 15, respectively. Like when the Browns had the COVID issue with the wide receivers and lost to the Jets in week 16, my youngest son was so pissed off during the week. He's like, now we have to beat the Steelers, and they're going to want to keep us out of the playoffs, and we're never going to make it. I was like, oh, my God, you're me from 15. I was like, isn't this fun? He's like, this sucks. I can't believe we lost to the Jets. And I was like, just think of how good it's going to feel when we beat Pittsburgh. We're not beating Pittsburgh. And then we beat Pittsburgh on Sunday, and he was so happy. And then Tuesday morning, we wake up, and our coach has got COVID and can't coach. He's like, the league is screwing us. I was like, dude, it's going to be okay. And then when we won, it's just like, holy smokes. And had a legit shot to up in Kansas City once Mahomes went out of the game. It was great. And it doesn't feel like a 1-year find. It feels like they've got their quarterback, that they've got their coach, and they finally have a direction, which in Cleveland is so strange.
Well, Chris, I appreciate you getting up early out on the West Coast to do this for us here. Best of luck with the podcast, the Chris Rose Rotation Podcast. Once again, you can find it wherever you get your podcast. It's through JomBoy Media. JomBoy's been a great guest on the show numerous times over the years. So thanks again, Chris. Best of luck with the podcast. And, I just downloaded the one that you guys posted today with Archie Bradley. I look forward to listening after our show.
Awesome, Jake. I appreciate the time. Anytime. Thanks, man.
Chris Rose with us there. You can find him on Twitter at Chris Rose. And of course, check it out, the Chris Rose Rotation Podcast through JomBoy Media. We take a quick break and wrap it all up for you. It is the Jake Asman Show, and you're listening to us here on Sports Map Radio on